I am your host, Nicole Will, and we're so happy you're here as we navigate the world with your aging loved one. We are here to come alongside older adults, family members, and the senior living community as we explore the world of aging and elder care with helpful resources, informative interviews, and approachable conversation. We get to do this together, so join us on our journey, and this is the willGather podcast. It has been said that grief is as individual as a fingerprint, and I found that to be true in my life and in conversation with others. And to quote Jamie Anderson, grief, I've learned, is really just love. It's all the love that you want to give but cannot. All that unspent love gathers up in the corners of your eyes, the lump in your throat, and in the hollow part of your chest. Grief is just love with no place to go. But how do we process that? How do we start to find some semblance of healing and in the midst of caring for a loved one and anticipating the loss? Dr. Eboni Green is my guest today. She is a registered nurse and a family caregiver. She holds a Ph.D. in human services, specializing in healthcare administration. She is the owner of Caregiver Support Services, a nonprofit organization that provides resources, solutions, and support for caregivers. Dr. Eboni Green is also the author of At the Heart of the Matter, Caregiving in the New Millennium, and Reflections from the Soul, which talks about grief and has a framework for taking our grief and processing and moving into reflection. Today we talk about grief, what challenges caregivers face, what different types of grief that we're processing, how do we channel those emotions and grief into reflection, what does that process look like, and how do we know that we're on the journey to healing. I admire Dr. Eboni Green's work. I admire her heart, her gentleness, how she shares about her personal story and professional journey, and her insight into grief. Here is my conversation with Dr. Eboni Green. Hi, Dr. Eboni. This meeting is a long time coming. Thank you for being here. I'm so happy we get to have this conversation together.
I'm excited to be here as well, Nicole. Looking forward to today's conversation.
Can you share with us more about you and your background?
Absolutely. So I started my career as a nursing assistant in long-term care. My grandmother was a registered nurse, and she was the one that took me to the long-term care facility to apply and where I received my training. I really have a passion for working with our elders, and later became a nurse and found out about long-term care administration through a internship. And so it's kind of funny how life guides us where we need to go. And as I was working in long-term care, I started to see that families, this was in the late 90s, that families really didn't have an understanding of the long-term care system. And they certainly didn't have a concept of being a family caregiver and what that all entails.
I have found that to be really true. Working with older adults in senior living, families are at a loss a lot of times. They're not quite sure who to talk to, or they have a lot of questions. So I am so happy you're in this space and can really support those families.
Yeah, it's very meaningful work. And as I mentioned, I'm so glad that life took me through those experiences, because then the experience was helpful in our personal life as we started aging and having parents to care for ourselves.
Yeah, you started a company. Can you tell us what that is and how it supports those families and caregivers?
Absolutely. So our organization is Caregiver Support Services, and we started that in the late 90s after we found that need for caregiving, and we provide training and support for family and frontline caregivers. And we are a place to share, a place to turn, a place to learn for caregivers.
We're going to actually get into a lot of those details too of what people can find with caregiver support services. We're going to talk more specifically today about grief because it really does affect everyone. And also in response to when you were talking about where life leads you and those journeys, I always share with people to really be open to, you might start in one place. I had started working as a nursing assistant while I was in college studying nursing, actually. And through that, realized that I was in a nursing home and realized that there was actually a whole industry and field of study in gerontology, which I didn't really know existed. And it brought me towards more of that part of my career, which you think life is leading you in one direction and then you head in another direction. So I love that commonality that we share of being open to evolving and changing and growing where life leads you. You never know what's next.
Absolutely. And then having that opportunity to kind of reflect on how being open is meaningful too.
What brought you to wanting to talk about grief?
So I think that what really prompted me to start thinking about grief is that it's a very difficult topic to broach. And so when for some number of years I actually taught through caregiver support services in-person training for nursing assistant medication aides. And a lot of those folks would either go into the field professionally or they would be the designated caregiver for the family, and maybe an insurance company or something of that nature was going to compensate them. I say all that to say that it is having a conversation about grief is very difficult. People don't necessarily want to talk about it. I think that we find our ways to cope, and then we don't necessarily go into it thinking that I'm going to cope with my grief today. We find those coping mechanisms, and then we kind of bury those feelings deep inside until we're triggered by something. And so we would spend a day, a morning, and we had really very meaningful conversations about grief and loss. And it was powerful. It was a way for individuals to connect what they were doing, why they were going into the caregiving field or going to care for someone that they love. And I feel like most people don't get that opportunity to really talk about how they feel, how losing someone that they love never leaves you, and how it influences the things that you do moving forward. And so I knew that I've written 3 books, and I knew that the 3rd book would be about grief, and really worked on that topic for a long time. But as I mentioned, it's so difficult to broach. It's so difficult to talk about. And so we had a few losses as I was writing, family members that we cared for. And so all of that love and feelings of sadness and understanding is poured into that.
There was someone that had talked about how grief is really that love with no place to go, and it just sits with us. And I thought that was such a beautiful explanation of what that looks like. And it's true, you talked about how people don't always have a place to share that and to share what they're thinking. You talk and meet with a lot of caregivers. What are those challenges that caregivers are facing right now?
Well, I think primarily, and I'll put myself in this category because over this last holiday, I actually lost my father like right before the holiday season started.
So sorry.
And it's different when you're talking about caring for clients whom you've grown attached to or parents that you have cared for and lost. I think that when you don't have a place to share your feelings, or you don't even know. And this is what I find most with caregivers, is that if I open up and share my sadness, then where am I going to go from there?
Mm.
You cope with it each day. And I find myself having those feelings right now with the loss of my dad, who was a Marine officer, a gentleman,
Mm.
a confidant. When I talked about caregiver support services and the things that I wanted to do with this, even many years ago, he was a great supporter and understood. And, not everybody gets what it is that we do,
Mhm.
but he did.
Yeah.
And so it's very difficult, I think, even when I'm talking about my personal daily life, to then find ways to cope and then have something trigger your sadness and you don't
Mhm.
know what that's going to be.
Mm.
And after a little while, family and friends, after that initial period, family and friends are not necessarily there. You've had a memorial service or a service
Mhm.
and you've gone through the initial shock. And then now here you are as a caregiver,
Mm.
left with that time slot that you were using to provide care, and
Mhm.
your social network may have changed,
Mhm.
and now what are you going to do with your time? And you don't know what's
Mhm.
going to trigger your
Mhm.
sadness. So that's a very long answer to that question,
Mhm.
but I just
Mhm.
really think that other people are moving along in
Yeah.
life and they're not necessarily knowing how difficult it is for a caregiver to process their grief.
I'm glad that you explained all of that because there's loss and there's loss and grief in a lot of ways, and you touch on something that is something that caregivers face after they lose a loved one that they've cared for, and it's that time that they've spent. How do you fill that time? And the word identity comes to mind, where you take that as part of your identity has been in that role of caring for someone, nurturing that relationship, spending time with them. And when that's taken away, there's a big adjustment that happens.
Yes, and I think that, as advocates, Nicole, we
Mm-hmm.
really encourage caregivers to identify as a caregiver because that's how they're going to mainly find and access resources.
Mm.
And so now that you're no longer in that role, then how do you take the experience that you had when you're ready
Mm-hmm.
and apply that? Where does that take you? Maybe it's just that there's someone that you can better understand that other folks may not understand their experience. So maybe it's just one person that you're going to impact
Mm-hmm.
and help through your experience that you've had as a caregiver. Or maybe
Mm-hmm.
there's something else that you're going to fall into and be open to as a result of
Mm-hmm.
caregiving. And maybe you won't, this will be your experience,
Mm-hmm.
and you'll move on and do other things that don't have anything to do with caregiving. But I don't find that to be the more prevalent of
Mm-hmm.
the things that I mentioned. That I
Mm-hmm.
find that people generally have additional caregiving experiences,
Mm-hmm.
and that other folks need
Mm-hmm.
their help and support when you're ready to be able
Mm-hmm.
to offer that
Yeah.
to some.
Yeah. I'm a personal example of that. My mom cared for my grandma who lived in our home. And then my grandma was able to move into the senior living community where I worked at the time. And once my grandma had passed away, my mom had come to the senior living community probably every day and would visit her and make sure she had everything that she needed. And once she passed, she really struggled with how to fill that time and her identity in that. And she ended up taking some time to grieve. And obviously, that we know grief doesn't just end, it's cyclical, and a lot of things play into that. But now she spends her time, she's taken that and now continues to go to a senior living community every week to visit and meet with older adults. And that part of, like you said, you find that you tend, once you're in that role, then to continue that in some capacity. And so that could be encouraging for other caregivers that feel like, oh, does that end when my loved one is gone? But it can continue in different ways.
Yeah, and it often does.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think that's so beautiful
Mm-hmm.
because that was probably something that, as your mom was there, she's seeing folks that maybe don't have
Mm-hmm.
people who are who are able to come
Mm-hmm.
and visit as frequently as now she can.
Mm-hmm.
And so extending that love
Mm-hmm.
to additional people is
Mm-hmm.
individuals, I think is what makes what we do and makes the world a better
Yeah.
place in general.
Yeah, I think so too. There are different types of grief, and everyone's grief is really unique. What type of grief do you find is most present when we're in that caring role? There's a term called anticipatory grief. Can you share with us what that is?
Well, I absolutely can. And I do want to kind of preface this with
Mm-hmm.
the fact that when I was in preparation, I knew, like I said, I knew I was going to write reflections from the soul. And so when I was working on my PhD, I took a class in that was specifically on grief. It was a counseling level class for psychiatrists and psychologists.
Wow.
And I had an opportunity to read so many things from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross.
Mm-hmm.
So I do want to kind of say that one of the things that I think we're often faced with grief is this expectation of the length of time and how we're going to experience it. We know that anticipatory grief is where we are experiencing that grief while we are caring for someone. It's often very frequently associated with diseases like dementia, where you're maybe slowly watching that person lose memory of current things, but you still have the blessing of the past memories and things of that nature, and so you kind of grieve the relationship there. So you have that feeling of anticipatory grief while you're caring for someone. But I do want to say, with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, I think that sometimes we feel like with our grief it's going to be this linear process because we talk about those 5 stages of grief. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did a fabulous job with the grief model in that she spent her career training doctors and nurses and did a lot of interviews with people who were dying. And so when she did her research, she primarily focused on the individual dying. And that's why when we get to the end of the 5 stages of grief, there's this level of acceptance. And so when we apply that then to the living, we then put ourselves in this category that even if it is anticipatory grief or complicated grief, that at some point we're going to have this level of acceptance and then our grief is going to be lifted. And it's simply not true, because what she was looking at was persons who are dying themselves and not the living. So although the stages can apply, they weren't necessarily designed to talk about the living.
I'm so glad you shared that distinction, because you're right. A lot of people are familiar with what those stages are, and we get to that point and you think that, okay, there's some things that should be happening and healing, and to know what her research was and the background of that is a relief and helpful.
Yeah, because you look at the different models and it'll look like this like nice linear, and then in 12 months my mother-in-law, who we cared for, passed away maybe 4 or 5 years ago now.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, I had complicated grief. I didn't really acknowledge in my heart that she was gone. And then I am a person that I'm a type A, so I tend to just pile on more so that I don't necessarily have to deal with my feelings. And then all of a sudden, I just hit a brick wall and just, was just like in such a deep, dark feeling and of complicated grief, and had to actually I had a counselor, but I had to actually reach out and talk to a therapist because, and I think that it's meaningful to share that because I think people don't necessarily, if your grief is complicated, you're not going to probably work that through that yourself. You definitely need to talk to someone um, and get outside of your head and when what you are doing, because I know the things to do, doesn't or is no longer working, then it's time to go to that next step and say, hey, I really need some additional help here.
Being able to reach out. And when you use that term complicated grief, I haven't heard that before, but I think it so realistically explains what grief can be for people.
Yes. So with complicated grief, it's like your sadness just is like a throbbing
Mm,
sadness. It's persistent.
mhm.
And I was fine for like, oh, Nicole, for a full year. I was perfectly fine, I thought. And the thing is that my husband is from Nebraska. I grew up a military brat. And so we only relocated here after college. And so having our children and having her just down the street and my father-in-law just down the street. And so we were very active in each other's daily lives. And then when she got ill and we took care of her and those types of things, we were all as a family involved in that so that she could be home. And so it was such a loss. And I don't think I realized how having her here in Nebraska, because my mom doesn't live here, was like filling that whole mom void. And then it was a while after I lost that she passed that I was able to start thinking, well, this is why it's so significant. 20 some odd years of having this person there and for all the little funny things and the things that you drive each other crazy with, but you can laugh at the end of the day. And she was just she was a nurse too. And she was just a very accepting person, and to lose that in the family, and then I also think that sometimes with complicated grief, my son, when I talked to him once, he said, Mom, he was really crying, and he said, you and Dad are so strong. I don't know how you are doing this. And because it's his grandmother and his grandfather passed too, and so he's very profoundly impacted by that. And I had to let him know we cry. We cry all the time. And sometimes you drive by a place and you don't know that just driving in that direction, or
Mhm.
you don't drive in that direction and then you have to one time and you're like, whoa,
Oh, yeah.
this is why I don't come this way. So
Mhm.
it's not an easy thing, and it doesn't just impact us. It also
Mhm.
impacts the rest of the family
Yeah,
too.
those around us. When you really do life with someone like that and all of the little things that you can't even plan for, you just do and exist and share that loss is so deep and it's so profound.
Yeah. I had something that was like a life goal or what have you. And my dad had been in an accident before he passed away. And so the Friday before he passed, I was so happy about it. It was uh, being a part of residency for doctoral students. And I'd gotten to the end of the residency and was just so excited because I remember when I was graduating and we were seeing all the different professors and such on their computers. And he was like, one day you'll probably get an opportunity to do that. And he hadn't passed away yet, but that day when I got done with that residency, I just cried and cried and cried. And I know that it was because um, those moments are things that only him and I understand the importance of. And those days are hard. It's kind of sometimes, even right now in the present, to share things because those are things I know he'd be so excited and proud of. And I know he's not going to be there to share it. And so I'm kind of being a little bit selfish with and protective. I've had to like let go of Facebook for a while, and just let my family and friends know, hey, I'm going through this time that I really need to do things that are going to be protective of me, because I know I don't have, he was my rock, and I know I don't have him there. Um, and it's very hard. It's very hard.
Yeah. Well, I'll celebrate that with you. And I understand that protectiveness, it's when you feel fragile, you want to put this wall of protection around yourself because you just don't want anything to infiltrate that could like disrupt that, and you want to hang on to that, almost like that's your sacred bond with your dad. And
Mhm.
so honoring that and just continuing, I think the fact that you're just continuing to share about him and how incredible he was, and that can be therapeutic too.
Yeah, it can. It
Yeah,
can.
I know. And I think taking a break on social media is a good way to protect that space too, because so much can come at us. I tried to do that a little bit over the holidays to kind of create this space with my family and not be so bombarded with everything or work and life, and it just is always there, and it's it's
And Facebook
always
is a little sneaky because they still will send you emails to your
yes.
and so you'll see certain things. And then my
Mhm.
birthday just recently passed, and so you've got all these people, and it's just
Mhm.
like I have my daughter, I have an older daughter, and I have
Mm.
her just go on there and thank everybody and say, hey, mom is still grieving. And um so she's thankful for your responses. And I know for work and things like that, I do go to the caregiver support Facebook. It's just like the personal part of things. I know pictures are going to pop up, and folks, he was very loved. And so I just have to protect. I found that to be a protective thing. Sometimes, too, you have to um, maybe not have the conversation or answer calls from people who are going to be triggers, or who are going to we all know we have folks in our lives that we love, but that we also um, uh, maybe shouldn't have that daily communication with, because they, especially when you're low, they can somehow trigger your emotions. So those things are, I think, important too. And I use the acronym: acknowledge your feelings, give your time for yourself, time for introspection, and reflect so that you can heal. And I call that AIR. So I remind myself of that quite often. And I think it's very helpful for caregivers too, because again, you don't know what is going to trigger your grief. And I think holidays, just getting over this holiday season, probably has not just been a struggle for me, but it's probably been a struggle for a lot of caregivers too. Even if there's just a difference because of the pandemic, and not and changing some of your traditions and things that you would do, we're grieving those things too.
And when you talk about those different things that you're putting in place, I love the word boundary. It's almost like you're creating those boundaries to protect your time while you're grieving. And for caregivers, also, sometimes people reach out to us to help. They want our help in processing their grief, and we can't always take that on.
Right. Yeah, I think that's so important. One of the things I think is really helpful when if you are reaching out, or if you're setting boundaries for someone else when they're reaching out, you're that person's go to, is to ask them, is this a good time? Like, I don't know if you have a person in your life, but I do, that we are my cousin, we're like sisters. Like I said, I grew up an only child. And I found it that sometimes when I'm in, I just need to talk to someone mode, it may not be the right time for her. Or when she's in the, I just need to call and vent and talk to someone. Maybe I'm not in the right headspace. So in the last few years, we've both really set the boundary that we will say, is this a good time? Because if it's not a good time, then probably what's going to happen is the other person is distracted. So then you're frustrated because you don't feel like they're listening, or you're already so overwhelmed with your own things that you're processing that you don't have the patience to fully listen or understand, or because most of the time the person is not, I know when I'm calling, I don't want necessarily advice. I just want my feelings to be acknowledged and to have a time for me to reflect on it. And then later on, maybe I spend some time looking at myself from an introspective purview, just setting that expectation that, is this a good time? That way it's just not like, hello, and then the person just goes right on
Yeah.
into all the 50 things that they're annoyed about or what have you. And that's important when we're caregivers, because sometimes it's not a good time.
Yeah. I know my listeners can't see me, but I'm like adamantly shaking my head. Yes, yes. That's such a good reminder for everyone to just pay attention to and remember, because you want to, when you're sharing all of that deep stuff, to have it be heard and for you to feel supported. And if it's not a good time, you're going to feel really empty and like, ooh, it always feels bad when you're being really vulnerable and someone else isn't holding that vulnerability for you, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And especially if it's been, you feel like you've done that and it's not reciprocated,
Mm-hmm.
it is immensely frustrating. And especially if that's your person. And so then you may pick up the phone and call. I find that caregivers say this a lot, I have this person that I prefer to be my person of support. And but the person that calls me is not the person that I would prefer to
Mm-hmm.
have the conversation with.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes that's another thing that I think is difficult, is that you have relationships with individuals where you just click and you get each
Mm-hmm.
other. My
Mm-hmm.
cousin and I forget what we're talking about
Mm-hmm.
in the middle of the conversation, and we just keep talking until, oh yeah, and then we can go back. And so it's
Mm-hmm.
that kind of a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And she does taxes, um and so she has gone back to work uh at this point of the year, and so I had to really like make a plan
Mm-hmm.
for myself, because I know I'm grieving and I know that I'm not doing the social media thing, and then she's going to be at work. So, what are some things I'm going to do for myself so that I, again, am making that protective plan
Mm-hmm.
while I'm grieving?
Thinking ahead about, okay, you know what you're going to be needing, and then how do you set that plan in place? There are a lot of emotions that come out as a result of grief, and we don't always know that it's like tied together. So I'd love for you to talk about what are some of those things that we experience that we don't know that it's grief maybe showing up, and maybe we do, but why is it important also for us to work through that grief? Like, what happens as a result of that if we don't? That was kind of a long question, two pronged, but tied together in some ways.
Well, I think what happens is that you can find, and it really depends on your coping strategies, and you can find yourself coping in unhealthy ways. And what I mean by that is, you might not tie the fact that You are not maybe wanting to go and do things with friends
Mm-hmm.
with the fact that you're grieving.
Mm.
You're just like, oh, I'm tired and I don't want to, go hang out with friends, or I don't want to take the girls' trip, even though I don't have caregiving responsibilities. Oh, I don't want to. So you find that you exclude yourself from
Mm.
things. You may do other things in excess. So, drinking or smoking, eating unhealthy. You also may do things like have really a hard time falling asleep. Sometimes it's something as simple, but equally impactful as I remember when my Aunt Cynthia passed away. I felt like she was one of those persons that was just hilarious
Mm.
and a happy person all the time. And I feel like for a while, I didn't feel like it was okay to laugh.
Mm.
And and then my husband my aunt had schizophrenia. She had it my whole life. And we were birthday twins, very close. And my husband went to Walmart one night, and my aunt had this thing where, similar to this gentleman, where this gentleman had like a whole cart full of groceries. So the poor cashier goes in and scans all of these things, and 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 my husband just has like aluminum foil.
Mm.
So he's behind the guy with a huge cart of things. The guy gets everything scanned, and the cashier tells him the amount, and he says, "Oh, I don't have that kind of money." So, she had to go through the process of, everything's bagged and
Yeah.
the whole nine.
Oh.
And it sounded like this was something that this person did. And I know my aunt, she would have loved to work and things like that, but couldn't because of her condition. So
Mm.
she was always on a fixed income. And one of her things was going to like Kmart or Target or whatever and putting things on layaway that she was never going to get out of layaway.
Yeah.
And then maybe mid-month, she would go and get those things off layaway, and then she'd have the money from what. So but she got the pleasure of shopping without
Yes.
actually spending
Mm-hmm.
the poor cashier. So when he came and told me that, we laughed so hard. And we said, that was Aunt Cynthia
Mm-hmm.
letting me know that
Mm-hmm.
it's okay for me to laugh again.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes it's just those things we do. We don't necessarily know that that's tied to our grief. But
Mm.
when I reflected on it, I was like, I feel guilty about laughing because she's not here.
Wow.
And she would want me to really laugh about
Mm-hmm.
this guy and these millions of groceries that
Mm-hmm.
it's like 200 and something dollars worth
Oh
of
my goodness.
groceries.
And the time. Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
yes, yes.
Uh, you said a really poignant word of the reflection, which leads us to you wrote your book, Reflections of the Soul, and looking at how do we, and our question to you is how do we take and channel all of those emotions and grief then into that reflection?
Well, I think that you can do it you can do it by taking that time to naturally, like by taking the time, like you were saying earlier, like doing the thing with the having some hot lemon water, or
Mm,
those are times where you're not actually engaged in doing stuff,
mm,
and your mind will actually naturally go to the things that you really feel strongly about. They'll kind of pop in to your head. And sometimes what you'll start to see is that you're ruminating on the same thing.
mm-hmm,
And then that's kind of a trigger, or a mechanism, a warning mechanism, that if I'm consistently ruminating on this particular thing, having this thought over and over and over again, okay, then let me think about how can I address it? And so, reflections, I really tried to use examples of famous people and folks that I know who had profound grief, who experienced profound grief, like Bobby Kennedy. A lot of times you don't necessarily recognize that Bobby Kennedy, in a time where we wouldn't think of a caregiver, was a caregiver to President Kennedy, because he had several really complicated medical conditions. There's a story where they say, that Jack Kennedy was so sick as a young man that his friends would say if a mosquito bit him, they were afraid of what
What?
might happen to the mosquito
Yeah.
from biting him because he was so sickly
Mm.
growing up. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think part of even the reason that Bobby went to Washington with his brother, they were close, but it was more about at that time not talking about your medical conditions. And so someone being there who understood his condition and could be there to protect him in that way. And so it's kind of the first part of the book is really kind of sprinkled with those types of stories. Teddy Roosevelt lost his mother and wife within a 24-hour period
Mm.
of time.
Wow.
And so he went out to the West,
Mm.
and like that's why we have the national parks, is because
Mm-hmm.
through his grief he went out into nature and was
Mm.
able to use that. And so when he became president, he really focused on preservation because that was something that helped him. Nature helped him work through his grief. So I try to use really interesting stories that he's never going to get over the fact that he lost his mom and his dad on the same day, but that you can channel that into something meaningful, like both of us have discussed today, how we were able to channel that into something meaningful. You were talking about your grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the second half of the book, then there's actually questions that coincide with each of the chapters that then prompt you to document those things.
And that second half, that is the workbook that you created. Is that correct? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Which is such a great accompaniment because oftentimes we'll read books and then we've learned all of this knowledge, but we don't necessarily then know how to work through that or implement it or process it. And when you were sharing about the stories that you included, I view stories, and just like I wanted you to share more about yourself, is because I think each one of us can identify at some point to a story and find the nugget of what that is meaningful for us or the truth in that story, and then be encouraged by it or challenged by it or can learn through that or identify with it to be able to go, okay, I see that in myself, and so then how can I move forward and grow or process?
Yes, and I think too that many of us are documenting our own roadmap
Mm-hmm.
for processing our feelings of grief, of sadness, of happiness, of, challenges, how we're coping with those. And it's like a journal. If you have a journal that you wrote in, if you're a journaler, and you don't know what that poem or section of what you were journaling is going to mean. And then sometimes you pick it up and you're like, wow, I was saying some really good things to myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this would be helpful for another person. And so I feel like the more caregivers that are able to document their personal journey, because everyone's not going to relate to everything that everybody else experiences. We all have our own uniqueness in our journey. And I think that that's what makes it special.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think what makes it special is being able to reflect on that by actually writing answers to different prompts. And you never know what that's going to mean to you later on
Mm-hmm.
down the road.
Mm-hmm. One of my favorite things that someone had shared with me was, and it speaks to the importance that you put on documenting that process, because especially as in our grief journey, or even as an entrepreneur, when you're doing whatever that hard thing is, when you're in it, it's hard to see through that. And I was told by a friend of mine to write down whether it's the littlest thing, whether it was a quote that someone gave you, or you're like a little success. Someone emailed me and said they really enjoyed the podcast, or whatever that could be. Or I remember this really great time when I remembered that I could laugh in the memory of my aunt for you. And when life gets so crazy, we don't always remember what those little things, seemingly little things are. And so just to keep record of that, because there's been times when I've looked back and I've gone, oh my gosh, I've come so far, or oh my gosh, that's right, that was really meaningful to me. It's the remembering of that and then being encouraged by that. And so taking that time, especially in grief, to be able to go back and document the process and use that workbook and use that as something you can hang on to and then look back on and see how that journey has grown and changed.
And then you never know, because I know I have books and things that I've kept for a long time, or my mom is a keeper of all things.
Mm-hmm.
And so you never know if someone else down the road in your family is going to go through something and may not see the way through it.
Mm-hmm.
And that one thing that you wrote in your journal or in your book, or you just don't know what it is that's going to resonate with someone,
Mm-hmm.
and that's going to help them through that next day or
Mm-hmm.
moment or period.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't know always what it's going to be for you, because
Mm-hmm.
sometimes we have these big plans and expectations for ourselves, and then we grieve that it didn't happen that way. And then I think the more that you take the time to write those nuggets, that you find that you think, oh, I'm doing these podcasts, are people really getting anything out of it? And then boom, someone sends you something and says, this has really been meaningful and helpful, and it gives you that strength and encouragement to go ahead and do that next thing.
Mm-hmm.
And we need that.
Mm-hmm.
It's not always easy when you're in the thick of things, to acknowledge and recognize how far you've come, whether it's in your grief or your caregiving situation or your business. And so those little opportunities to see that, wow, I really have made it so far from where I thought I was gonna. And it might be different,
Yeah.
but it's good.
And grief is so not linear. We talked about that before, where it's not like, okay, we're going to start here and then we get to the end, and allowing ourselves that grace to let it come and go and ebb and flow. But when do we know that we're maybe more on that journey to healing?
I think that it's kind of like you don't know until it hits you that it's okay, that certain things are okay. For my aunt, it was it okay to laugh? And for my mother-in-law, it's okay to remember. It's okay to miss her. It's okay to laugh about some of the little things that she would do. And of course, we would never say anything, but I can even say that, like, I know I don't drive down the street down that way. And I was kind of surprised by it. My husband and I went to get vaccinated. We had to go in that direction, and we're just talking, and we go on past the house, and I just got so quiet, and I was like, I didn't know that was going to hit me. So I think you have your moments where you can feel really good. My dad, my stepmother is coping by, posting all these hilarious pictures and things. I'm not there yet. I see something that comes from his email or his picture pops up, and I don't know how, I might have to go lay down.
Mm-hmm.
And I am okay with that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it really depends on the intensity of the relationship, the love that you shared, the way the person passed. Did you get a chance? I did. I got an opportunity to fly out to the DC area and spend 2 days with him and tell him how much I love him and all of those types of things before. But those things can impact how you feel, and if you feel like you are moving on and being able to do your normal daily activities. I think too, sometimes what we do too is we don't have the family gatherings. I mean, right now we have COVID, but think about, are you not having family get-togethers, or, just that small group? Right now, I know, like I said, COVID, but could it be that seeing everybody together triggers? So you've got to maybe make new traditions and be happy in those, even though there are people that are missing. So I think it's very different for each person, and I think that you just don't know what's gonna make you just fall over laughing,
Yeah.
and you don't know what's gonna touch you like a feather, and you're gonna be
Right.
crying the rest of the day.
Yeah. It's a mystery every day. And also, I think we don't know that we've maybe healed through something until after we go, "Oh, I didn't cry at that moment when I did before. Okay, there's some progress here." And crying is okay. It's healing and it's therapeutic and all of that. Where would you say for people, and I know, and I want you to share about the resources that you have, but do you have any other favorite resources that you like to direct people towards when they're in that process of grief?
I really do encourage, there's a center called I think it's the Center for Healing, and they have really great, they're out of Nebraska, and they have really great grief resources, not only for adults, but really focus on, children, because explaining things to them can be really challenging. I also think that there are a lot of smaller groups that may be either a Facebook group or a church group, and you might find those things through like a counseling service. They usually have a plethora of resources that may be helpful for you in your particular community.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's just kind of finding those things that are going to be healing to you. And you may be like, oh, I don't support groups, I wouldn't do that. But you never know what you're going to be open to
Mm-hmm.
depending on where you're at in your grief.
Yeah.
Keeping those options open.
And you offer so much more than what we've talked about today with grief. So can you share with us more? How do you support caregivers in general? You've got a great tool, the Ask Emma Caregiver Wellness Tool, and also, yeah, so many services. So I'd love for you to share with us about that, and then where people can get in touch with you and learn more.
Absolutely. So we offer the Ask Emma tool. I love to share about that. Emma was my mother-in-law that I've been talking about this whole
Oh,
time. And so we named that for her. And Ask Emma is a wellness tool for caregivers. So you answer the questions, and then once you press submit, she'll say, hey, this is where you're doing really well. She'll actually talk to you, and then give you your overall wellness score. And then we have 9 components of wellness. And she'll give you tips on one area where you might work to improve your well-being. And there's like a free downloadable guide for that area, and then resources listed there. So that's very helpful, including people that you could reach out to who are experts on that particular topic. And then we also have resources and comprehensive guides where you can go and kind of find some of the bigger issues, what I mean, more common things that
mm-hmm.
caregivers need. And through that, you might find other resources. We have videos on our page that are free for you to just kind of check out on different topics, like how to visit a loved one in long-term care. Um, we have meditation and wellness things listed there for caregivers too. And then we also provide training. So we find that most caregivers feel as though they could really benefit from training.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've really started looking at things like normal aging, preventing abuse, infection, preventing the spread of infection, and medications, things of that nature. And we're kind of just going on down the line. Those
Mm-hmm.
come with guides, videos, interactive resources, and such as well. So
Mm-hmm.
we have a blog, and we probably have new blogs posted at least 3 or 4 times a week. And so that's also a place where you might, find some information, additional links, and things of that nature. And I can be reached at our website is caregiversupportservices.org. And you can always reach me via email or the contact us page or the phone number.
It's a wonderful tool for caregivers. I've been on your website and you and I have had conversation and been able to witness the wonderful information and support that you provide for others. So I encourage people to go check it out.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. Ebony Green, for this meaningful conversation, and it's a conversation that needs to happen and we need to talk about it, and I really just appreciate your time and personal insight into all of it. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today, and I do hope that the listeners get a nugget or two out of what we shared today.
I think so. Thank you. Thank you for listening today. If you enjoyed our episode, please subscribe and give us 5 stars. In all honesty, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for listening to our episode.